Terry Speaks was a former Marine struggling after the breakup of his family.
His wife told him she was unhappy and she was taking the kids.
But he would find a new chance at happiness with a free-spirited woman named Margaret Sanchez.
She just looked like she was beating to her own drum and not conforming to society's norms.
Their romance turned into a never-ending party full of passion and excitement. But their celebration would be cut short by a horrifying crime.
The body had been decapitated, dismembered. The skin had been purposely cut away.
It's bad enough that you would murder somebody, but then why would you cut their skin off, too?
The hunt for the killers would lead police into a dark world of the occult.
Police found books on black magic in their home.
And along the way, prompt a terrifying question. What dark lengths would two soulmates go in the name of love?
They were just extremely evil. No remorse. I mean, nothing.
June 7th, 2012. Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. It was just after 5:30 p.m., and municipal workers were performing daily maintenance on a local beach when one of the workers spotted a strange object that had washed up on shore.
The workers were used to finding trash left by the tourists, and with it, even some dead wildlife.
But the workers soon realized he'd stumbled onto something far more terrifying.
They found what appeared to be a torso on the beach.
Within minutes, the beach was swarming with police.
I arrived on the scene, was pointed out to the torso, the upper half of the body, and it appeared to be dismembered.
CSIs determined the torso was that of a young woman. But who was she? And where was the rest of her body?
I've never seen anything like that in my life or in my career. Who could have done something like this?
You just can't wrap your mind around somebody doing something like that. Like, what would motivate you?
The answers would ultimately reveal the gruesome truth behind a dark romance and a pair of killers with a motive too terrible to believe.
We learned just how evil people can be.
Born in Surrey, North Carolina in 1972, Terry Speaks started off life on the wrong foot.
His father was a no-show. Mother was disabled, not discovered until later on in life, but always. Raised by his grandmother.
When you're in a rural household, just there with your grandmother, then your duties are going to be compounded. I think he probably had to be both a father of sorts, and he had to be the man around the house, and I think that was probably tough.
Terry worked odd jobs after school to help pay the bills, but he also wanted to enjoy the same things as other boys his age. By his senior year, he'd begun dating a local girl, and it wasn't long before they became seriously involved.
He fell in love, of course. In high school, they were like, he was class president, you know, king and queen of White Plains.
The couple married right after graduation, and it wasn't long before they had 2 children. In need of a way to support his family, Terry decided to enlist in the Marines. But being stationed away from home added stress to the marriage. And Terry's wife soon filed for divorce after only a few short years together.
She told him she was unhappy and she was taking the kids. And that crushed Terry. His wife came from money, and Terry knew he couldn't fight her in court.
The divorce created bitterness between Terry and his ex-wife, and as a result, she had made it nearly impossible for him to see their children. Terry was left reeling. After completing the rest of his service, he retired from the military and began working at restaurants around North Carolina where he'd been stationed. For the next year, he struggled with the pain caused by the loss of his family. But not long after his divorce was finalized, Terry soon met someone he hoped could give him a second chance at happiness.
He met this woman named Cindy, and according to him, it was love at first sight. They had a child together, and finally, it looked like Terry's life was turning around for the best.
He's finally seen himself in a sort of traditional and successful kind of marriage. a family, all these things that so many people want to have in life that he had not had. And now he does have it.
But Terry's newfound happiness hit a bump not long after the wedding, when his work in the restaurant industry required a move to New York. Terry's wife decided to stay behind with their newborn child in North Carolina. Once again, the distance and time apart created problems.
Terry's second wife told him she wanted a change, and she filed for divorce while he was in New York.
Crushed over the loss of his second marriage, Terry fell into a deep depression, turning to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain.
He was devastated about his children always, not being able to be with his children. I know there was some suicide attempts.
After several months, Terry's drug use and emotional problems caused his ex-wives to cut off contact completely. Terry felt lost but was determined to find a way to turn his life around. So he packed up and left New York. For years, he roamed the country, only stopping in one place long enough to make some money so he could continue his travels.
He was living this lonely, nomadic life, just trying to escape the pain he felt inside.
In 2011, Terry landed in New Orleans, where he got a job working as a bouncer at a bar on Bourbon Street.
He loved the French Quarter. It was full of all kinds of crazy, weird people just having a good time.
He must have seen the French Quarter as an incredible escape. There isn't anything to compare it to in any other city.
But Terry's stop in New Orleans would be more than just another temporary pit stop. It was there that Terry would meet a mysterious young woman who would pull him out of his depression and unleash hidden desires inside of him. 28-year-old Margaret Sanchez. Born and raised in Louisiana, Margaret Sanchez started out as a young girl with a thirst for adventure and a need to express herself.
Margaret was a real handful growing up. She was always moving 1,000,000 miles an hour and was very easily distracted.
Just looked like she was beating to her own drum and not conforming to society's norms.
But Margaret's rebellious spirit and individuality also led to constant clashes with her mother. And the wilder Margaret acted, the more her mother tried to rein her in.
Her mother wanted Margaret to go to college and get a job, but Margaret was not having that.
Margaret couldn't wait to strike out on her own and find a place where she could be herself. So the moment she graduated high school, she packed up her bags and moved to nearby New Orleans.
Margaret Sanchez must have felt right at home in the French Quarter because it's really kind of a circus.
Margaret was particularly drawn to the area's distinct history as a hub for those skilled in the art of black magic.
She started getting really interested in voodoo. She loved the idea of black magic. It just added to the mystique of living there.
And to support herself, Margaret found a job as unique and eccentric as the city itself, as a fire-twirling street performer.
She would do things like twirl batons on Bourbon Street and had worked in different clubs off and on for a while.
It was a weird job, but Margaret was really good, and she made pretty good money doing it.
In 2012, Margaret was entertaining a crowd of tourists outside a Bourbon Street bar when one particular onlooker caught her eye. Terry speaks.
She notices Terry staring at her, and she locks eyes on him. And it's like she and Terry are the only two people in the world.
After her performance, Margaret introduced herself to Terry and invited him to come with her to a party her friends were throwing.
Margaret was very forward, and she asked Terry to hang out with her within seconds of meeting him. To Terry, Margaret was like a breath of fresh air. She had this unique energy and vibe that he just could not resist. He had never met anyone like her.
Terry learned just how fast Margaret moved that night at the party.
Margaret sneaks Terry away to a bedroom and seduces him, and they are having sex within hours of meeting, and Terry cannot believe this is happening.
Terry was different from the men Margaret usually dated. He was the strong and silent type, a former Marine who made her feel safe and taken care of. And for Terry, Margaret's eccentricity and infectious lust for life opened a door he thought had been closed forever.
Terry found Margaret exotic, exciting, and very sexy.
She basically pulled him out of his shell. He felt alive again.
As the two explored the French Quarter together, Terry embraced everything about Margaret's bohemian lifestyle. And even though they'd only been together for a few months, Terry and Margaret both knew their love was meant to be. So they decided to make it official.
They were married by one of the doormen down on Bourbon Street.
After all the pain of his previous marriages, it seemed that Terry had finally found true love with Margaret, and the couple happily started their new lives together in the Big Easy. But their story was about to take a much darker and more sinister turn. Coming up, Mississippi police try to identify the remains of a dismembered torso, but they're stumped by a disturbing clue.
There were numerous areas where the skin had been purposely cut away.
This was done the way a hunter would, or maybe a butcher.
After a whirlwind romance, New Orleans newlyweds Terry Speaks and Margaret Sanchez were basking in the glow of their honeymoon.
He's a twice-divorced Marine. She's a fire-twirling street performer. I mean, it was the kind of fairy tale romance that could only happen in New Orleans.
But less than 60 miles away, homicide detectives in Mississippi were dealing with a situation that would send shockwaves all the way back to the French Quarter. On June 7th, investigators were called to the popular Bay St. Louis beach, where maintenance workers had made a horrifying discovery.
I received a call from dispatch. They had what appeared to be a torso had floated up on the beach.
Investigators were able to determine that the torso belonged to a young woman, but they weren't able to determine much else. The rest of her body was missing, including her head.
It makes it hard to identify a victim like this. We had no fingerprints, no dental records we could go with.
The medical examiner estimated that the victim had been in her late teens to early 20s. He was also able to determine the cause of death.
What the autopsy determined was that there had been a single stab wound to her heart.
Then, after letting the woman bleed out, the killer had dismembered the body to get rid of the evidence.
The autopsy also revealed that the killer had cut off more than the victim's head and limbs.
There were numerous areas where it appeared the skin had been purposely cut away.
It's bad enough that you would murder somebody, dismember them, but then why would you cut their skin off too?
The medical examiner had a theory about the patches of skin that had been taken from the body.
The skin was cut out where tattoos were.
Her tattoos and her body piercings and things like this, that's almost like a fingerprint. They had to decapitate the body. They cut off the hands, they cut off the feet, because all of those things bore distinctive markings that would have immediately led investigators to determine who the victim was.
But as careful as the killer had tried to be, they'd managed to overlook one small detail.
They didn't take her jewelry off of her torso.
When they found the torso, it had a very distinctive belly button ring.
Armed with the victim's gender, age, and a description of her belly button ring, investigators searched through missing person reports. They quickly found a possible match.
A young lady had been reported missing that morning.
She was employed on Bourbon Street as a dancer, an exotic dancer.
They look at her photographs, the location of the tattoos and the locations on the torso where the skin had been purposely cut away. It had the same locations of the tattoos in the photograph.
And it was something that led the cops right to who the victim was.
The missing woman was 22-year-old Jaren Lockhart. She had been reported missing that morning by her boyfriend, Jeremy. He told police that she texted him that she was leaving the strip club where she worked the night before, but she never came home.
She texted, I got a ride, and that was the last thing that Jeremy heard from her. And then Jeremy reported her missing the next, a couple hours later.
But who had given Jaren a ride? And had that person also killed and dismembered her? While police searched for answers, Margaret Sanchez and Terry Speaks were indulging their passion for life and for each other. And their days were spent exploring Margaret's fascination with local folklore and voodoo. But news of Jaron Lockhart's grisly murder would soon darken the newlyweds' celebration. Later that afternoon, Mississippi homicide detectives learned several more body parts washed up on shore.
Her head was found in the Pass Christian Harbor, 3-4 miles from where some of the legs and clothing and so forth were found.
They did find the skull, and there were dental records, and that was another piece of the puzzle that helped the cops identify who'd been killed here.
Once the head was found, the police matched it with dental records and officially identified Jaron's body.
As the vicious details of the crime scene were being reported by the local news, police felt a surge in pressure to find out what happened. Homicide detectives began interviewing Jaron's friends and family, who were horrified by how some locals and the media were responding to her murder.
Some were like, well, what do you expect? She was a dancer or she was a stripper. If she would have been some girl walking down Bourbon Street that happened to, they never would have said that. It just makes me sick.
To Jaron's loved ones, she was more than just an exotic dancer on Bourbon Street. She was a kind-hearted single mother doing whatever she could to provide for her young daughter.
They said she just loved for that child. She just loved that little girl. And what they wanted people to know is that she was much more than just somebody who danced in the French Quarter.
Jaron would give you the shirt off her back to do anything for anybody.
And they said Jaron hadn't planned on dancing on Bourbon Street much longer.
She had dreams of one day going back to school and getting a degree in cosmetology because you can tell by her pictures she loved makeup.
Jaron's friends had no idea who could have wanted to hurt her. However, there was one person detectives were particularly interested in talking to, Jaron's boyfriend, Jeremy.
He became a suspect right away. And that's always the case in murders because most of the time the victim knew the killer. And so that was obviously somebody that the investigators would immediately look at as a possible suspect.
But when detectives interviewed Jeremy, he seemed devastated by Jaron's death, and friends backed up his claims that he'd been with them the whole night.
The boyfriend had a good alibi, and he's actually reported her missing. We felt strongly that it was someone else.
No one loved Jaron as much as Jeremy did. Jeremy and Jaron, they were gonna marry.
Everyone detectives spoke with told them Jaron didn't have any enemies, but they knew that in Jaron's line of work, a woman didn't necessarily need enemies to be in danger.
It's already could be a dangerous profession depending on decisions you make or you don't make.
None of Jaron's co-workers remembered seeing her leave the club that night. But when investigators reviewed the security camera footage, they finally found what they were looking for.
They were able to get the tapes from the security camera and pinpoint the time around 2 a.m. when Jaron left the Bourbon Street bar where she was dancing.
And Jaron wasn't alone.
They saw that she left with a man and a woman.
Who was this mysterious couple? Had they been giving Jaron a ride home as she'd text messaged her boyfriend? Or were they luring her into a deadly trap? Coming up, police learn more about the mystery couple caught on camera through a tip from a concerned parent.
She was the one who provided the tip to the police that that might be my daughter.
And an interview with a possible murder suspect takes a bizarre turn.
This was just a big play to her, like she was starring in a movie, and she was going to make it as good as it could be.
Newlyweds Terry Speaks and Margaret Sanchez hadn't known each other very long before they decided to take their passionate Bourbon Street romance to the next level. And as far as Terry was concerned, Margaret hadn't only made his life complete, she'd saved it.
Terry had been in a really dark place, moving from city to city, trying to deal with the pain of not being with his kids anymore.
She pulled him out of his depression. Life with Margaret was like one big party.
But while Margaret and Terry's love flourished in the French Quarter, police were investigating the gruesome fate of another Bourbon Street party girl. 22-year-old exotic dancer and single mother Jaren Lockhart had been identified as the victim of a terrifying homicide when her dismembered body parts washed ashore 60 miles east of New Orleans.
This was a bizarre type crime. Just the vicious nature of it was shocking.
When investigators reviewed security footage from the club where Jaren worked, they'd spotted her leaving in the company of an unidentified man and woman. Several dancers recalled the couple offering them money to dance privately, but they hadn't given their names.
They had approached a couple of the girls and offered them some money. Hey, you want to come back and have a private party? Whatever, that might mean.
Investigators wondered, had Jaren accepted the couple's offer only to be lured into a terrifying trap?
There was still a lot of mystery as to what happened to her and how did she end up going from that night in the French Quarter to her body parts washing up on a beach.
In the hopes of identifying the mysterious couple, police enlisted the aid of local media, asking residents to contact a tip line if they saw them.
We released photos that we had secured from different video segments to the media.
And they said, this is who, we believed were people of interest.
It wasn't long before police got a call from a Louisiana woman who told them she'd immediately recognized the couple because the woman in the video was her daughter.
She identified the woman as Margaret Sanchez and the man as her boyfriend.
Margaret's mother told detectives that Margaret had been irresponsible and out of control her entire life, but things had gotten worse after she moved to New Orleans to become a street performer.
She had got into the drug scene. She was a heavy drug user and pretty much didn't have anything to do with them at that point.
Margaret's mother said it was her daughter's hard partying lifestyle that initially brought Margaret and Terry together.
They both had the same interests: drugs, alcohol, sex.
Margaret's mother told police she'd always feared her daughter's destructive path might one day go too far, but she never dreamed it would end in murder. Until she saw two people that looked like Margaret and Terry in the security footage broadcast on the news, and something in her gut told her they were involved.
In our business, we mostly have mothers defending their children, but you could tell that she had come to grips with who Margaret was. So she felt pretty confident that, Margaret had committed this crime.
Mother's intuition aside, detectives didn't have any evidence tying the couple to Jaren Lockhart's murder. So investigators ran a background check on the couple. Margaret didn't have much of a criminal record to speak of, but Terry was a different story. When Terry had left North Carolina for New York in 2004, he told his friends and family the move was for work, but it turned out that Terry had a different reason for leaving his home state.
Terry Speaks was a convicted sex offender.
In 2003, when he was still married to his second wife and living in North Carolina, Terry had been accused of having a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl. Terry told police he thought she was 19, but a judge was unsympathetic. He was found guilty of statutory rape and sentenced to 3 months in prison. Terry's wife had left him while he was in prison, and when Terry was released, instead of following the terms of his probation, he'd gone on the run.
He was wanted for failing to register as a sex offender.
Terry Speaks had a record. He was a bad guy. And while it didn't have anything like murder, that's a big red flag for any investigator.
Armed with the tip from Margaret's mother and the outstanding warrant for Terry's arrest, investigators put out an APB on the couple. 2 days later, patrol officers spotted the couple's car on the South Louisiana highway. Officers pulled the vehicle over, but before they had a chance to approach the car, the driver's door suddenly flung open.
Terry Speaks jumped from the vehicle and took off running.
We ended up having to chase him into a field.
The chase didn't last very long.
He tripped and fell. The deputies was on top of him pretty quickly.
They don't know if he's running because of the warrant or the murder. But you know what? It doesn't look good either way.
Investigators arrested Terry for his outstanding warrant and charged Margaret with harboring a fugitive. They brought the two in for questioning, hoping to use the charges as leverage to get them to talk. But Terry played dumb, claiming that he ran not because he was guilty of anything, but because he was confused.
He just said he was scared. He just ran because he didn't know what was going on.
And as far as the murder of Jaron Lockhart, Terry claimed he didn't know anything about that either.
He invoked his Miranda right soon after the interview began.
Detectives hoped they would have more luck when it came to Margaret, but she seemed determined to be just as tight-lipped as her husband.
She was real evasive. She pretended as though she did not know the reason for her being in custody.
But investigators didn't let up. They confronted Margaret with the videotape evidence of her and Terry leaving the club with Jaron.
She was asked when they had departed from the club, was there another female in the company with her and speaks? She said, I can't remember.
In fact, Margaret claimed the only thing she did remember was that she'd gotten sick from food poisoning that night.
She said once they got back to the house in Kenner, that she was throwing up all over the place. He was busy cleaning up her mess.
Investigators weren't buying it, but before they could press her further, Margaret's behavior suddenly went from evasive to bizarre.
She went to a corner and she put a blanket around herself and she immediately started sucking on her thumb.
Margaret's odd behavior brought her interview to an end, but it left police wondering what they'd just witnessed.
Is this a residual from drug abuse? Does she have a mental defect? Or was she trying to portray herself as somebody who was insane?
It was like this was just a big play to her, like she was starring in a movie, and she was going to make it as good as it could be.
Whether she was high on drugs or simply putting on an act, detectives believed that both Margaret and Terry knew more than they were willing to say.
Here they have clear video of them leaving the club with Jaron, but you know what? Neither of them would even admit to knowing her.
They claim they didn't know Jaron, that they were just random people that happened to pass by at 2 a.m. on Bourbon Street.
Investigators were convinced Margaret and Terry weren't telling them the truth, and to find out what the couple might be trying to hide, police secured a search warrant for their home. When police went inside, they immediately noticed something peculiar.
The house was cleaned beyond clean. We found a lot of bleach and cleaning chemicals.
Investigators couldn't find any evidence that Jaron Lockhart had ever stepped foot inside the house. They did, however, find a few things inside the home that caught their interest.
Margaret had a lot of books on the human anatomy. And I can remember seeing these books thinking, well, this is why you know where to cut people's limbs off.
And that wasn't all. Inside the couple's bedroom, police also found what looked like a crude altar.
Some of the items on the altar, fish sculptures and stuff like that related to the sea, shells and so forth.
And next to the altar, police found even more unusual and disturbing reading material.
Police found books on black magic in their home.
But what did it all mean? Were police just looking at evidence of the couple's interest in bizarre superstitions? Or were these dark clues leading to a possible motive for Jaron's murder?
Was this some type of satanic ritual?
Coming up, detectives learn more about Margaret and Terry's fascination with the occult.
If they sacrificed this young woman, all their problems would go away.
And the couple's relationship begins to fray when one worries the other is about to rat them out.
He was like, I'm sitting in jail and keeping my mouth shut, which is keeping you out of jail. You're the one they'll fry, not me.
Terry Speaks and Margaret Sanchez were a pair of newlyweds that police believe were responsible for the brutal murder and dismemberment of 22-year-old exotic dancer Jaron Lockhart. Both Terry and Margaret had been arrested on outstanding warrants, and while a search of their home had uncovered a strange altar and books on the occult, it hadn't produced any physical evidence linking them to the crime.
We searched over top to bottom, P-traps in the sink, in the dryer. We looked everywhere to find anything.
Investigators searched Margaret's car next, where they did find potential evidence. CSIs found grains of sand in the car's upholstery and strands of human hair that appeared to match Jaron's color. But DNA analysis of the hair was inconclusive, and investigators were unable to come up with any physical evidence to charge the couple with murder. Finally, 8 weeks after their arrest, a Louisiana judge dismissed the charges against Margaret, and she was released from jail. Meanwhile, Terry was sent back to New York to serve time for failing to register as a sex offender. Jaron's murder case went cold, but detectives were still committed to bringing her killers to justice.
It couldn't stop there. So we were all determined, even keeping Jared's picture on the wall. I told one of the investigators, we got to bring closure to this. This girl's got a family. They want answers. You know, we want answers.
But after a year, detectives were no closer to catching her killers. They decided to make another attempt at interviewing Terry, hoping his time in prison might have weakened his resolve or made him more willing to turn on his suspected partner in crime.
He's been in jail for a year while Margaret's out living life. Maybe his feelings had changed and he'd be willing to give her up.
But a few minutes into the interview, they realized that Terry's feelings for Margaret hadn't changed. They were stronger than ever.
You still keep in contact with Margaret?
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah. Love the woman.
Terry told police that he and Margaret had decided to turn over a new leaf. They were both getting clean, and once he was out of prison, they planned to start a family together. And as far as Jaron Lockhart's murder, Terry hadn't wavered about that either.
I don't remember her, and I don't remember her having in the car with us. I don't remember going to Mississippi. It all sounds like something being made up to me.
But you don't remember what you did that night.
I'm telling you that I wasn't with no girl.
Investigators tried to rattle Terry, confronting him with the inconclusive evidence they'd found.
We found hair fibers inside the backseat of the car. So we know she was in the car. There was sand in the car. So we know where the sand came from. If you were a jury, what would you think?
But if police were hoping to get Terry to crack, they would be disappointed.
He didn't get a whole lot of information from Speaks. He was more interviewing us to try to see what we knew.
But detectives did learn something from going over the prison's record of inmate correspondence. Investigators requested copies of the emails Terry and Margaret had been sending each other. And after combing through hundreds of messages between the lovers, detectives found a common and incriminating theme.
Speaks was telling her to keep her mouth shut.
He was like, I'm sitting in jail and keeping my mouth shut, which is keeping you out of jail. I think that was one of the most damaging statements that he had made, is you're the one they'll fry, not me.
As they went through the emails, detectives also found several references to a rare astrological event.
They'd found something in their emails about a planetary alignment of some sort called the Venus Transit. Only happens once every several hundred years.
And in the occult books police found at the couple's home, there were references to the same event. According to those texts, it was historically a time for human sacrifice.
Ancient Indian tribes sacrificed a female and disposed of the body in the ocean.
And the date of the most recent alignment of Venus was one already eerily familiar to investigators.
They would have had to do this ritual on June the 5th to the 6th, and that's when Miss Lockhart was murdered.
Detectives took a closer look at the occult and black magic books from the couple's home and learned that the deadly ritual was supposed to bring about miraculous results.
So the theory becomes, if you make a human sacrifice during the transit, you'd be cleansed of all your demons.
Investigators were stunned. Could this bizarre ritual be the motive behind Jaren's murder? And if so, what demons were the lovers trying to get rid of? Detectives were able to answer both of those questions when two of Terry's prison cellmates came forward and revealed incriminating conversations they'd both had with the suspected killer. Terry told his cellmates he was still deeply in love with Margaret, but he claimed their relationship hadn't always been so strong. Drug abuse and Terry's lingering grief over the breakup of his family had at one time driven a wedge between the lovers.
They went through this period where they were just doing all these drugs, and with that, they were fighting all the time.
But Terry told his cellmates that the couple had solved their problems in a very unique way. One of Margaret's friends was a practitioner of black magic, and he'd taught the couple how to protect their relationship by performing a special ritual designed to bring them closer together.
If they sacrificed this young woman and dump her body parts in the ocean, all the problems would go away.
It seemed Jaren Lockhart had been the unlucky victim Terry and Margaret had chosen to sacrifice.
You know, the aspects of this, they seem unbelievable. They're like out of some bad horror movie, right? Where the killer chops up the bodies and stuff. And even in New Orleans, as jaded as we are, this one was kind of a chart topper.
But which of the lovers had been the driving force behind this bizarre and gruesome plan? Had Terry's drug abuse and depression over 2 failed marriages driven him to consider such a desperate act? Or had Margaret's fascination with black magic suggested the perfect way to get rid of her husband's grief and put his focus back on her? With neither willing to talk, police would never know for sure. But between their emails and the testimony from Terry's cellmates, authorities finally had enough to charge Terry and Margaret with first-degree murder.
We knew. We definitely have our people. The information that we knew was going to be hard to deny.
But facing life in prison, would the lovers stick by their story? Or would the truth about their gruesome crime finally be brought to light? Coming up, prosecutors present their theory about how the lovers lured their victim to her death. But when Terry finally takes the stand, will his testimony destroy their case?
He still had the same personality that I'm smarter than the jury. I'm going to get up here and I'm going to outsmart everybody.
When Terry Speaks fell in love with free-spirited street performer Margaret Sanchez, he knew he'd found the only woman who could pull him out of his downward spiral of depression. But police believed the couple had been willing to go to any length to exorcise the demons of Terry's past, including murder. And although they both continued to deny their involvement, prosecutors were convinced they had enough to convict the newlyweds.
He and Margaret had killed this young woman, Jaren Lockhart, and dismembered her as part of a ritual sacrifice.
The lovers were set to stand trial separately, and when Terry's finally began, prosecutors presented the jury with their theory about what happened that fateful night, starting with the couple's bizarre motive.
According to them, to cleanse themselves of Terry's past and his grief, they had to sacrifice this woman and dump her in the ocean.
Prosecutors told the jury that Terry and Margaret had approached several exotic dancers in the French Quarter, but only Jaren, who was short on rent for the month, agreed to go with them when they offered her $700 for a private dance back at their home.
She agreed to go and do this private party, you know, whatever that might entail. And unfortunately, she left with them and never came home.
The DA believed Terry and Margaret put their deadly plan into action once they had Jaren inside their house. Margaret grabbed Jaren from behind and held her, while Terry stabbed her once in the heart. Then, after Jaren was dead, prosecutors claimed that the couple had used the anatomy books police found in their home as a guide for the grisly dismemberment.
That wasn't part of the ritual, but they thought if they cut her up, they wouldn't get caught.
You know, I think they thought they were going to get away with it. And that's why they had taken all these drastic steps. They believed that that was going to throw enough of a curveball to the police that they would never solve it.
They literally cut this girl in as many pieces as they could possibly do, and we didn't even find all of her body. When her little girl gets old enough, how do you tell her, this is what happened to your mom? How do you do that?
After offering up their timeline for the night of June 5th, prosecutors presented the evidence, including traffic cameras that showed Terry and Margaret's vehicle traveling to the Mississippi beach, where they believed the couple dumped Jaren's body.
Their car was captured on camera leaving Louisiana and headed into Mississippi. That, was good evidence against him.
When it came time for Terry to present his defense, he surprised the court by making a bold move.
He didn't feel like his attorneys were doing a well enough job, and he felt like he could do better if he defended himself.
On the stand, Terry confidently stood by his story, claiming that he'd never even met Jaren Lockhart, so he couldn't have killed her. But his strategy didn't have the effect Terry had hoped for. On June 19th, the jury found Terry guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison. With Terry's conviction, Margaret's confidence about her own upcoming trial began to waver.
She realized, surely I'm going to be convicted if he's convicted.
Margaret decided to enter a guilty plea to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But even with her guilty plea, Margaret never confessed to the true motive behind the murder. With Terry and Margaret both behind bars, it seemed like justice was finally served for the family and friends of Jaren Lockhart. But questions about the strange case still linger, especially about what made the couple feel that human sacrifice was the answer to their problems. The only thing that seems clear is that when Terry and Margaret found each other, his troubled past and her bizarre obsessions proved to be a deadly combination.
We learned just how evil people can be.
On the morning of August 29th, 1991, Palermo awoke as it always had. The streets slowly filled with commuters heading toward offices, workshops, cafes, and markets. Store shutters rolled open one by one. Cars squeezed through familiar intersections. The rhythm of another ordinary Sicilian morning had already begun. Nothing in those first quiet moments suggested that within minutes, a murder would shake not only the city, but the conscience of an entire nation. It happened quickly. A man left his home, walked toward his car, and never reached the driver's seat. A gunman approached at close range. Several shots were fired. 3 bullets struck the victim in the head, before the echoes disappeared into the surrounding streets. The killers had already escaped on a motorcycle, disappearing into Palermo as though they had never been there. The man lying on the pavement was 67-year-old businessman Libero Grassi. Within moments, his life had ended. Yet the story of his death had begun long before that August morning, and it would continue for decades afterward. The murder of Libero Grassi was never simply about eliminating one individual. It was intended as a warning, a carefully calculated act of terror designed to remind every entrepreneur in Sicily that there were rules no one was permitted to challenge. For generations, organized crime had relied not only on violence, but on predictability. Everyone knew the system. Everyone understood the consequences of refusing it. Most importantly, everyone understood that survival often depended on silence. That silence had a name deeply rooted in Sicilian history, omerta. It was more than fear. It was a social code that discouraged cooperation with authorities, encouraged private endurance over public resistance, and allowed criminal organizations to thrive in the shadows between intimidation and resignation. Many people despised the mafia. Many quietly resented its control over their neighborhoods and businesses. Yet relatively few dared to oppose it openly, because doing so meant risking not only one's livelihood, but the safety of family, friends, employees, and anyone connected to them. Against this backdrop, the death of Libero Grassi became something extraordinary. Not because he was the wealthiest businessman in Palermo, not because he held political office, not because he commanded influence over thousands of workers. He became extraordinary because he did something almost unimaginably simple. He said no. That refusal, spoken publicly and without disguise, transformed him from an ordinary factory owner into one of the most recognizable symbols of resistance against organized crime in modern Italian history. His murder raises questions that remain compelling more than 3 decades later. Why would a successful textile manufacturer become such an important target? Why would one letter provoke an organization as powerful as Cosa Nostra? Why would experienced criminals consider it necessary to kill a man whose only apparent weapon was his willingness to speak openly? Perhaps the most unsettling question is not why the mafia decided to murder Libero Grassi, but why they believe they had to. Violence within organized crime often follows an internal logic. Rivalries, betrayals, territorial disputes, and retaliation frequently explain why certain people become victims. The killing of Libero Grassi followed a different logic altogether. According to investigators, the motive was clear from the very beginning. It was retaliation against a businessman who refused to submit to the system of extortion known throughout Sicily as Pizzo. Under that system, countless businesses regularly paid protection money to criminal organizations. Refusal could bring vandalism, arson, financial ruin, or death. The payment itself represented far more than money. It represented obedience. Every payment reinforced the authority of those demanding it. Every business owner who complied silently confirmed that the system remained intact. That is precisely why public defiance carried such enormous symbolic weight. If one respected entrepreneur could openly reject extortion and continue living freely, others might begin asking whether they could do the same. Organized crime depends as much on reputation as on force. Fear is effective only as long as people believe resistance is impossible. The moment someone demonstrates otherwise, the entire structure begins to appear less inevitable. For Cosa Nostra, allowing such a challenge to stand unanswered threatened something far greater than the loss of one extortion payment. It threatened the perception of absolute control. Yet before examining the investigation, the trial, or the legacy that followed, it is necessary to return to the months leading up to that fatal morning. The gunshots on Via Vittorio Alfieri were not the beginning of this case. They were its conclusion. The true story began with a decision that seemed almost deceptively ordinary. A businessman choosing not to pay money to criminals. It continued with another decision that proved even more remarkable. Rather than refusing in private, Libero Grassi announced his refusal publicly. He did not whisper it among trusted friends. He did not negotiate behind closed doors. He did not seek anonymity. Instead, he allowed his position to become known, placing himself directly in the public eye. In doing so, he crossed an invisible line that few others had dared to approach. The consequences unfolded gradually rather than immediately. Threats emerged. Pressure increased. Isolation followed. Fear spread, not only around him, but among those connected to him. Even people who admired his courage found themselves confronting a painful question. How much risk was anyone willing to accept simply by standing beside him? That atmosphere of growing tension forms the heart of this story. Unlike mysteries driven by uncertainty over the identity of the killer, the murder of Libero Grassi presents a different kind of investigation. The central mystery is not merely who pulled the trigger, although that answer would ultimately take years to establish through the justice system. The deeper mystery lies in understanding how an entire society can become accustomed to a system in which extortion becomes routine, silence becomes ordinary, and courage becomes dangerous. Every murder leaves behind evidence. Some evidence is physical: shell casings, bullet wounds, crime scenes, witness statements. Other evidence is cultural. It exists in habits, expectations, fears, and unwritten rules that shape people's decisions long before any crime occurs. The murder of Libero Grassi cannot be understood solely through forensic facts or courtroom verdicts. It must also be understood through the environment that made such a killing possible in the first place. An environment where refusing to pay protection money was seen not simply as a financial decision, but as an act of open defiance. An environment where public resistance carried consequences extending far beyond one individual. And an environment where, even after shots were fired on a busy street in broad daylight, fear remained powerful enough to silence almost everyone who might have helped investigators. As this case unfolds, we will follow the path from principle to persecution, from public courage to calculated violence, from years of unanswered questions to eventual convictions. We will examine how one businessman became the center of a confrontation with one of the world's most notorious criminal organizations, not through weapons or political power, but through an unwavering belief that a business built through honest work should never be forced to finance those who ruled through intimidation. Before there were threats, before there was fear, before the murder that shocked Italy, there was simply Libero Grassi, a textile manufacturer from Sicily who believed that freedom and extortion could never coexist. Understanding who he was, the world in which he lived, and the choice that changed everything is where this story truly begins. To understand why Libero Grassi became the target of one of the most symbolic mafia assassinations in modern Italian history, it is first necessary to understand who he was, not as a public figure or a political activist, but as a businessman who believed that the independence of his company could not exist alongside submission to organized crime. His story did not begin with violence. It began decades earlier with a life devoted to work, responsibility, and the conviction that honest labor should remain free from criminal control. Those beliefs would eventually place him in direct conflict with a system that had become deeply embedded in everyday life across much of Sicily. Libero Grassi was born on July 19, 1924, in the city of Catania. Over the years, he became the owner of the Sigma textile factory in Palermo, employing approximately 100 workers. While those facts alone may appear straightforward, they reveal something important about his position within the community. He was not an isolated craftsman operating alone, nor was he the head of a vast industrial empire. He occupied a place somewhere in between, a respected entrepreneur whose factory represented both economic activity and the livelihoods of dozens of families. Every decision made within the business affected not only the company itself, but also the workers who depended upon it. Like many entrepreneurs, his daily responsibilities likely revolved around production, employees, customers' deliveries, finances, and the countless practical concerns involved in keeping a manufacturing business operating successfully. Yet in Palermo during the late 1980s, running a business required navigating another reality, one that existed outside official laws but influenced commercial life just as profoundly. Across much of the city, Organized crime had established a system that many business owners regarded not as an occasional threat, but as an unavoidable part of doing business. At the center of that system was a single word: piso. To outsiders, the practice could be described simply as extortion. Business owners were expected to make regular payments to mafia groups in exchange for so-called protection. In reality, however, the word protection concealed the true nature of the arrangement. The greatest danger rarely came from unknown criminals outside the neighborhood. It came from the very organization demanding payment. Refusing to comply carried consequences that everyone understood. Businesses that resisted could become targets of vandalism. Factories and shops could be damaged. Property could be destroyed. Arson attacks could follow. In the most extreme cases, owners themselves could be murdered. The effectiveness of the system depended on consistency. It was not necessary to threaten every business owner personally if everyone already knew what had happened to those who resisted. Fear performed much of the work. Stories traveled quickly through commercial communities. Every damaged storefront, every burned warehouse, every violent attack reinforced the same lesson. Paying was safer than refusing. Over time, the payment itself became almost routine. For many entrepreneurs, it was treated as another unavoidable operating expense. However deeply resented it might be, this reality shaped the environment in which Libero Grassi operated his textile factory. He was surrounded by a commercial culture in which compliance was often viewed not as approval of organized crime, but as a practical decision made to protect one's family, employees, and future. Many business owners undoubtedly disliked the system. Yet, disliking it and openly confronting it were entirely different matters. The risks associated with resistance extended far beyond financial loss. Choosing not to pay could jeopardize everything a person had spent years building. In such an environment, silence became its own form of survival. The fewer questions asked, the fewer confrontations occurred. The less attention drawn to oneself, the greater the chance of continuing business without catastrophic consequences. Against this backdrop, Libero Grassi held a fundamentally different view. According to the available facts, he believed that paying extortion money only strengthened the mafia. Each payment, in his eyes, reinforced the criminal organization's power rather than reducing the danger posed. Compliance did not purchase genuine security. Instead, it financed the very system responsible for creating insecurity in the first place. Equally important was another conviction that shaped his outlook. A business could not truly exist in freedom if it remained under the control of criminal organizations. This belief reached beyond economics. It reflected a broader understanding of independence. A company established through lawful work, employing ordinary people, could not be considered genuinely autonomous if its continued operation depended upon satisfying the demands of organized crime. In practical terms, such a philosophy placed Grassi in direct opposition to a structure that had become normalized across much of Palermo's business community. His position was not simply that extortion was wrong. It was that accepting extortion undermined the very idea of lawful enterprise. For many people, these convictions might have remained private opinions, shared only with close family or trusted colleagues. Private disagreement, after all, carried fewer risks than public confrontation. Libero Grassi, however, chose another path. On January 10, 1991, he published an open letter in a local newspaper addressed directly to those attempting to extort him. The significance of this decision cannot be measured solely by the words themselves. It lay equally in the fact that they were spoken publicly, rather than resisting quietly behind closed doors. He announced his refusal in full view of the community. The essential message of the letter was unmistakable. He declared that he had no intention of paying those demanding money from him. He emphasized that he had built his company through honest labor, not to finance organized crime. The statement was concise, direct, and unambiguous. There was no attempt to negotiate, no suggestion of compromise, no effort to conceal his identity. He openly identified himself as a businessman unwilling to participate in the system of extortion. According to the available information, this represented an unprecedented act in Sicily. For the first time, a businessman not only refused to pay Piso, but did so publicly under his own name. That distinction is critical. Quiet resistance and public resistance carry very different implications. A refusal known only to extortionists remains an isolated dispute. A refusal announced through the press becomes something else entirely. It transforms into an example that others may notice, discuss, and perhaps even follow. The publication of the letter immediately altered Libero Grassi's place within Italian society. He was no longer known merely as the owner of the Sigma textile factory. He became a public symbol of resistance against the mafia's extortion system. Yet symbols often carry extraordinary burdens. The same act that earned admiration from many observers also made him exceptionally dangerous from the perspective of organized crime. Criminal organizations rely heavily upon reputation. Their authority depends not only upon violence itself, but upon widespread belief in the certainty of consequences for those who challenge them. Public defiance threatens that reputation because it introduces uncertainty into a system built upon fear. If one entrepreneur could reject extortion openly without immediate submission, others might begin considering the possibility of doing the same. Whether many people actually would was almost secondary. Even the possibility represented a challenge. As a result, the publication of Grassi's letter accomplished two things simultaneously. It transformed him into one of the most recognizable voices opposing the payment of Piso, and according to the available evidence, it also made him one of Cosa Nostra's principal targets. Those two developments cannot be separated. His visibility became inseparable from his vulnerability. The very publicity that amplified his message also ensured that everyone, including those he had challenged, understood exactly where he stood. The months that followed would demonstrate how costly such visibility could become. Resistance did not end with the publication of the letter. Instead, the letter marked the beginning of an escalating confrontation. The conflict was no longer private. It had entered the public sphere, where every subsequent development would be interpreted through the lens of a businessman openly refusing to yield to organized crime. Looking back today, it is tempting to view that decision as historically inevitable because we know how influential Libero Grassi's legacy eventually became. Yet history rarely feels inevitable to those living through it. On January 10th, 1991, no one could know precisely how events would unfold. There was only a businessman who believed that honest work should never be taxed by criminal intimidation. And there was a criminal organization whose authority depended upon ensuring that such beliefs never spread unchecked. The distance between those two positions would soon become impossible to bridge. What began as a declaration of principle would evolve into months of mounting pressure, growing isolation, and relentless intimidation. The letter that introduced Libero Grassi to the nation also marked the point at which his ordinary life began to disappear, replaced by a reality in which every day carried the weight of a decision he refused to reverse. The confrontation had begun, and neither side showed any sign of retreat. The publication of Libero Grassi's open letter did not end the confrontation with those who sought to extort his business. It marked its beginning. By making his refusal public, he had transformed what might otherwise have remained a private dispute into an unmistakable challenge to a criminal system that depended upon obedience and silence. From that point forward, the consequences unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual campaign of intimidation designed to convince him that resistance carried unbearable costs. According to the available facts, the pressure appeared almost immediately. Grassi and his family began receiving threatening telephone calls. Although the precise wording of those threats has not been preserved in the source material, their purpose was unmistakable. They served as constant reminders that someone was watching, someone knew where he lived, and someone expected his decision to change. Telephone threats possess a unique psychological weight. Unlike an anonymous act of vandalism discovered after the fact, a threatening call invades the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Every ringing telephone becomes a source of uncertainty. Every conversation begins with the possibility that another warning may be waiting on the other end of the line. For Grassi and those closest to him, intimidation was no longer confined to the factory gates or the wider business community. It had entered the private space of home and family. The pressure did not stop there. His factory was broken into. Property connected to his business suffered acts of damage. There was also an attempted arson attack against the manufacturing facility. Each incident carried a practical consequence, but together they formed something much larger than isolated acts of destruction. They represented an escalating effort to demonstrate that refusal would never remain merely a matter of personal conviction. Every damaged piece of property carried an implicit message. Every unlawful intrusion reminded Grassi that the conflict could reach him wherever he conducted his business. Every attempt to undermine the factory threatened not only the owner himself, but also the stability of the company and the livelihood of its employees. Yet despite these acts of intimidation, the available evidence indicates that Libero Grassi did not abandon the principles he had expressed publicly. His refusal to submit remained unchanged. While the campaign against him intensified, another consequence of his public stand gradually emerged, one that proved emotionally painful in a different way. According to the historical record, many fellow business owners did not rally behind him. Instead, numerous entrepreneurs chose to distance themselves. Their reaction reflected the atmosphere in which they themselves lived. Supporting a man openly challenging the mafia risked drawing unwanted attention to one's own business. Even gestures of friendship or solidarity could be interpreted as acts of opposition. Fear therefore extended beyond the direct victim. It spread outward through commercial relationships, professional associations, and everyday social interactions. As a result, Grassi increasingly found himself isolated. Some customers also ended their business relationships with him, fearing that continued association might expose them to retaliation. From a practical perspective, such decisions may have appeared cautious or even necessary to those making them. From Grassi's perspective, however, they underscored a painful reality. The system he opposed derived much of its strength not only from violence, but also from the widespread belief that avoiding conflict was the safest course of action. Isolation became another instrument of pressure. A person standing alone is more vulnerable than one supported by a united community. When individuals withdraw, not because they disagree with a cause, but because they fear its consequences, the person remaining at the center of the conflict bears an even heavier burden. Grassi publicly criticized this silence and what he viewed as the resignation of Palermo's business community. His criticism was directed not simply at individual decisions, but at a broader culture of acceptance that allowed extortion to continue. According to the available information, he spoke against the willingness of entrepreneurs to endure the system rather than challenge it collectively. His position reflected the same principle that had motivated his original refusal. As long as businesses continued paying Piso, organized crime would retain both financial resources and symbolic authority. Every payment reinforced the impression that resistance was impossible. Every act of silence preserved the illusion that compliance was inevitable. These developments placed Grassi in an increasingly precarious position. He had become both a symbol of resistance and, simultaneously, a visible example of the risks associated with opposing organized crime. Law enforcement authorities recognized those risks. Police advised him to accept protective measures, including the use of bodyguards and ongoing security. Such recommendations reflected the seriousness with which the threats against him were viewed. The danger was neither abstract nor hypothetical. Authorities understood that his public challenge had elevated the likelihood of violent retaliation. Yet according to the available record, Libero Grassi repeatedly declined long-term protection. His reasoning was simple but profound. He did not wish to live like a prisoner within his own city. This decision has often been remembered because of its tragic outcome, but it also reveals something essential about his understanding of freedom. For Grassi, accepting permanent security would have meant allowing intimidation to dictate the terms of his daily existence. Although protection might have reduced immediate risk, it also represented an acknowledgement that ordinary life had become impossible. He refused to accept that conclusion. Consequently, he maintained his daily routine. Each morning, he continued leaving his home and walking to his car before driving to the Sigma factory. Such routines possess a quiet significance. Human beings often find reassurance in familiar patterns. Repeating ordinary actions affirms a belief that life remains fundamentally unchanged despite external pressures. For Grassi, continuing to walk to his car without altering his schedule reflected his determination not to surrender control of his everyday life. Unfortunately, predictable routines also create predictable opportunities. On the morning of August 29, 1991, that routine would end in violence. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Libero Grassi left his home as he had done countless times before. There was nothing in the available record to suggest that this particular morning appeared different from any other. He walked toward his car, preparing to begin another working day. Before he could do so, a gunman approached him at close range. The attack unfolded with devastating speed. Several shots were fired. 3 bullets struck Grassi in the head. According to the established facts, he died almost immediately. There was no prolonged struggle, no opportunity to escape, and no chance to respond. The assault had been carried out with lethal efficiency. Once the shooting ended, the gunman fled the scene on a motorcycle with an accomplice. The escape was equally swift. Within moments, those responsible had disappeared into the streets of Palermo, leaving behind only the immediate aftermath of a carefully executed assassination. The choice of method reflected the broader purpose investigators would later identify. This was not an impulsive act of violence. It was a targeted killing directed against a specific individual whose public actions had challenged the mafia's extortion system. The murder took place in daylight on a public street, during the ordinary flow of a working morning. Its visibility mattered. Violence carried out in such circumstances served not only to eliminate one man, but also to communicate a message to everyone who heard about it afterward. The news spread rapidly. A businessman who had openly refused to pay Pizzo had been murdered outside his home. The connection between his public resistance and his death appeared impossible to ignore. Yet the immediate investigation encountered a familiar obstacle deeply rooted in Sicilian society at the time, despite the fact that the shooting occurred on a public street during the morning hours. Virtually no witnesses came forward to assist investigators. According to the available evidence, fear and the cultural code known as omerta remained powerful enough to silence those who might have possessed valuable information. The absence of witness cooperation illustrates one of the defining characteristics of mafia: influence. Violence alone cannot sustain organized crime indefinitely. It is reinforced by expectations, habits, and fears that discourage people from speaking even after a crime has occurred. In the case of Libero Grassi, investigators were confronted almost immediately with that reality. A prominent businessman had been murdered in broad daylight. Yet the silence surrounding the crime proved nearly as striking as the assassination itself. The streets that had witnessed the attack offered few voices willing to describe what they had seen. That silence did not erase the apparent motive. From the outset, authorities regarded the killing as retaliation against Grassie's refusal to submit to the extortion system. The challenge lay not in understanding why he had likely been targeted, but in identifying the individuals who had planned and carried out the attack. Those answers would not emerge quickly. Instead, they would require years of investigation, persistence, and a breakthrough that initially seemed beyond reach. The bullets fired on the morning of August 29th ended Libero Grassie's life. But they did not end the search for accountability. The assassination had achieved its immediate objective of silencing one courageous businessman. What it failed to silence was the determination of investigators to uncover who had transformed months of threats and intimidation into murder. The path toward that truth, however, would prove to be long, difficult, and shaped by the same fear that had surrounded Grassie long before the fatal morning arrived. The murder of Libero Grassie was carried out in a matter of seconds, but the search for those responsible would stretch across many years. From the beginning, investigators were not confronted with a mystery of motive. Unlike many homicide investigations in which detectives must first determine why a victim was killed before identifying possible suspects, the circumstances surrounding Grassie's death pointed almost immediately toward a likely explanation. Months before the shooting, he had publicly challenged the mafia's extortion system. He had refused to pay Pizzo. He had published an open letter directed at those demanding money from his business. He had received repeated threats. His factory had been targeted. His property had been damaged. An attempted arson attack had already demonstrated that pressure was steadily increasing. Viewed together, these events formed a clear sequence that investigators could hardly ignore. According to the available facts, authorities quickly concluded that the murder was an act of retaliation for Grassie's refusal to submit to extortion. Establishing a probable motive, however, was only the first step. Criminal investigations require far more than a convincing theory. They require evidence capable of identifying individual perpetrators and ultimately supporting convictions in court. That task proved extraordinarily difficult. One of the greatest obstacles facing investigators was the same social reality that had shaped Libero Grassie's final months. Fear. His assassination had taken place at approximately 7:30 on the morning of August 29, 1991. It occurred on Via Vittorio Alfieri as Grassie approached his car outside his home. The attack was carried out in daylight on a public street, rather than in an isolated location. Under ordinary circumstances, such an environment might have produced numerous witnesses. Yet this case unfolded within a city where the influence of Cosa Nostra extended far beyond individual acts of violence. According to the available information, almost no witnesses were willing to cooperate with the authorities. Their silence reflected the enduring influence of omerta, the unwritten code discouraging cooperation with law enforcement. Fear of retaliation remained powerful enough that even a murder committed in broad daylight failed to generate meaningful public testimony. This silence illustrates one of the most formidable challenges encountered in investigations involving organized crime. Physical evidence can establish that a murder occurred. Medical examinations can determine how a victim died. Ballistic analysis may reveal the type of weapon used. Yet organized criminal organizations often rely upon intimidation to prevent the emergence of the one form of evidence that can prove decisive: human testimony. A witness who refuses to speak leaves investigators with unanswered questions. A community governed by fear can become almost as impenetrable as the criminal organization itself. In the aftermath of Libero Grassie's assassination, investigators therefore faced a paradox. They believed they understood why the crime had been committed, but they lacked the cooperation necessary to identify precisely who had carried it out. As months turned into years, the investigation continued without the breakthrough that many hoped would arrive quickly. The passage of time can be particularly difficult in cases involving organized crime. Public attention inevitably begins to fade. New crimes occur. Headlines change. Yet for investigators, unresolved cases remain active responsibilities. The murder of Libero Grassi had become more than the killing of a single businessman. It represented an attack on the rule of law itself. Failing to solve such a prominent assassination risked reinforcing the perception that Cosa Nostra could eliminate even its most visible opponents without consequence. Nevertheless, persistence remained essential. Investigators continued pursuing the case despite the limitations imposed by fear and silence. According to the available historical record, the decisive turning point did not emerge immediately from the crime scene or from eyewitness accounts. Instead, it came years later through a development that transformed numerous mafia investigations across Italy: the cooperation of former mafia members with the justice system. These individuals became known as pentiti, literally meaning those who had repented. Their role in combating organized crime cannot be understood simply as that of ordinary witnesses. A pentito possessed knowledge acquired from within criminal organizations themselves. Such testimony offered investigators access to information that had previously been hidden behind layers of secrecy, loyalty, and intimidation. In cases where traditional investigative methods reached their limits, cooperating insiders sometimes provided the crucial link between suspected criminal activity and identifiable individuals. The emergence of pentiti marked a significant shift in the struggle against Cosa Nostra. For years, the mafia had relied heavily upon secrecy. Internal decisions, chains of command, and operational details remained concealed from outsiders. Even when investigators strongly suspected mafia involvement in a particular crime, proving who had planned or executed it often remained extraordinarily difficult. Testimony from cooperating former members began altering that balance. Information that had once existed only within the organization gradually entered judicial proceedings. According to the facts provided, this was precisely what happened in the investigation into Libero Grassi's murder. The breakthrough came when cooperating mafia members provided statements identifying those responsible for the assassination. Their testimony indicated that the gunman was Salvatore Madonia, a member of the Risitana Mafia family. The significance of this identification cannot be overstated. For years, investigators had possessed a clear understanding of the crime's apparent purpose, but lacked definitive evidence linking the murder to specific individuals. The statements provided by the pentiti supplied precisely that missing connection. Their testimony also extended beyond the identity of the shooter. According to these cooperating witnesses, the murder had not been an independent decision made by one individual acting alone. They identified Francesco Madonia, the father of Salvatore Madonia, as the person who ordered the killing. This distinction reflected an important characteristic of organized criminal violence. High-profile assassinations are rarely viewed solely as the actions of isolated offenders. Within structured criminal organizations, such acts frequently involve both those who carry out the violence and those who authorize it. By identifying both the alleged gunman and the individual said to have ordered the murder, the testimony presented investigators with a far more complete picture of how the assassination had been organized. Even with these crucial developments, the investigation required careful legal preparation. Statements from cooperating witnesses represent evidence, but like all evidence, they must withstand scrutiny within the judicial process. Investigators, therefore, continued assembling the case, evaluating testimony, comparing accounts, and preparing the material necessary for prosecution. The years separating the murder from eventual convictions illustrate the complexity of building cases against organized crime. Justice in such circumstances often advances gradually rather than dramatically. Public expectations frequently focus upon immediate arrests following notorious crimes. Reality is often very different. Complex criminal organizations are designed to conceal responsibility behind layers of hierarchy and silence. Penetrating those layers demands patience, persistence, and evidence capable of surviving legal examination. Throughout this period, the murder of Libero Grassi remained a symbol of unfinished justice. His public stand against Pizzo had already become widely recognized throughout Italy. The continued absence of convictions only heightened the importance of the investigation. Solving the case was not merely about establishing responsibility for one homicide. It represented an opportunity to demonstrate that even crimes committed in defense of organized criminal power could eventually be brought before the courts. The gradual progress of the investigation also reflected a broader truth about confronting organizations like Cosa Nostra. Their influence depends not only upon violence, but also upon the belief that violence will remain unpunished. Every successful prosecution, therefore, carries significance beyond the individual defendants involved. It challenges the perception of impunity upon which organized crime depends. By identifying alleged participants through the testimony of pentiti, investigators moved closer to dismantling the aura of invulnerability that had long surrounded mafia operations. The years of uncertainty were slowly giving way to accountability. The investigation that began with a body lying beside a car on a Palermo street had evolved into a carefully constructed legal case supported by insider testimony. At last, the search for responsibility was approaching the courtroom, where evidence would be tested, accusations examined, and the justice system would determine whether those identified by investigators would ultimately be held accountable for one of the most consequential assassinations in Italy's modern fight against organized crime. By the time the case surrounding the murder of Libero Grassi reached the courtroom, more than a decade had passed since the morning he was gunned down outside his home in Palermo. 15 years is a long time in any criminal investigation. Memories fade, public attention shifts toward newer tragedies, and entire generations begin to know a case only through newspaper archives and television documentaries. Yet the passage of time did not diminish the importance of what had happened on August 29, 1991. If anything, it reinforced the significance of the judicial process that followed. The assassination of Libero Grassi had never been viewed as an ordinary homicide. From a moment investigators concluded that he had been killed because he openly refused to submit to the mafia's extortion system. The case came to represent something larger than the death of one businessman. It became a measure of whether the Italian justice system could ultimately hold accountable those responsible for using organized violence to preserve criminal power. The years between the murder and the eventual trial reflected the complexity of prosecuting crimes connected to Cosa Nostra. Investigators had spent years assembling evidence, overcoming the obstacles created by fear and omerta, and pursuing the information provided by cooperating mafia members. Those efforts gradually transformed suspicion into prosecution. According to the available historical record, the case eventually became part of a much broader judicial proceeding directed against numerous members of Cosa Nostra. Rather than focusing exclusively on a single homicide, prosecutors presented evidence relating to approximately 60 murders allegedly connected to the organization. The scale of the proceedings reflected the reality that organized crime rarely operates through isolated acts of violence. Individual killings often exist within broader patterns of criminal activity. Organizational discipline, and systematic efforts to maintain authority through intimidation. Bringing multiple cases together before the court demonstrated not only the breadth of the prosecution's work, but also the determination to address the wider structure responsible for repeated acts of lethal violence. Within this larger legal context, the murder of Libero Grassi retained a distinct symbolic importance. Unlike many victims of organized crime whose names were known primarily within judicial circles, Grassi had become a national symbol long before the trial began. His public refusal to pay Pizzo, his open letter, the threats that followed, and his eventual assassination had already become part of Italy's collective memory. Consequently, the legal proceedings attracted attention not merely because another mafia case had reached the courts, but because many observers regarded the outcome as a test of whether justice could eventually prevail over intimidation. According to the available evidence presented during the judicial process, the testimony gathered throughout the investigation played a decisive role. The breakthrough that had emerged through the cooperation of Pentiti now entered the courtroom, where their statements became part of the legal examination of responsibility. As in every criminal trial, the objective was not simply to repeat investigative conclusions, but to evaluate whether the available evidence established individual accountability according to the standards required by law. The judicial process demanded more than public belief or moral certainty. It required legal proof capable of supporting convictions. This distinction is fundamental to the rule of law. Criminal responsibility cannot rest solely upon widespread assumptions or symbolic significance, regardless of how compelling a case may appear in public opinion. Instead, the court must examine the evidence presented before it and determine whether the prosecution has established guilt under the applicable legal standards. In the case of Libero Grassi's murder, that process ultimately led to a clear conclusion. In 2006, the court convicted Salvatore Madonia for his role in the assassination. According to the findings presented in the case, he was identified as the gunman responsible for carrying out the fatal attack on August 29, 1991. The conviction represented the culmination of years of investigative work aimed at identifying the individual who had approached Grassi outside his home and fired the shots that ended his life. The court also convicted Francesco Madonia for his role in the murder. According to the available historical record, he had been identified as the individual who ordered the assassination. This aspect of the verdict carried particular significance because it recognized that responsibility within organized criminal organizations extend beyond those who physically commit acts of violence. High-profile murders carried out on behalf of criminal organizations frequently involve planning, authorization, and coordination that reach beyond the individual who pulls the trigger. By holding both Salvatore Madonia and Francesco Madonia legally accountable for their respective roles, the court acknowledged the organizational nature of the crime itself. These convictions marked the formal legal resolution of the murder after more than 15 years of investigation and judicial proceedings. Although no verdict could restore the life that had been taken, the judgments established official accountability within the framework of Italian law. For the Grassi family, the convictions represented the conclusion of a long legal journey that had begun with the shocking events outside their home in Palermo. For investigators, prosecutors, and judges who had worked on the case over many years, the verdicts demonstrated that persistence could eventually overcome even the formidable barriers presented by organized crime. Yet the significance of the trial extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Every successful prosecution of mafia-related violence carries broader implications because organized crime depends heavily upon the perception of impunity. Criminal organizations seek to convince both their members and the wider public that resistance is futile and that those who challenge their authority will suffer consequences without meaningful legal response. Courtroom convictions directly challenge that perception. They affirm that violence committed in defense of criminal power remains subject to judicial scrutiny and legal punishment, even when years separate the crime from the verdict. The long interval between the assassination and the convictions also illustrates an important truth about justice in complex organized crime cases. Public expectations often favor swift resolutions. Society understandably hopes that notorious crimes will be solved quickly and that those responsible will face immediate consequences. Cases involving powerful criminal organizations, however, rarely follow such a straightforward path. Layers of secrecy, witness intimidation, and the internal discipline of organizations like Cosa Nostra frequently delay investigations for years. The legal process in the Grassi case therefore reflects not failure, but persistence. Rather than abandoning the search for accountability because immediate answers proved elusive, investigators and prosecutors continued pursuing evidence until the case could be brought successfully before the court. The verdicts delivered in 2006 also carried profound symbolic weight because they affirmed the connection between Libero Grassi's public stand against Pizzo and the violence that followed. From the beginning, investigators had concluded that the murder was retaliation for his refusal to submit to extortion. The judicial outcome reinforced that understanding by holding specific individuals accountable for carrying out and ordering the assassination. In doing so, the legal process completed a narrative that had begun years earlier with a businessman publicly declaring that he would not finance organized crime. The courtroom became the final setting in which that declaration received an official legal response, not from the mafia, but from the institutions of justice. Nevertheless, even the most significant verdict has limits. A conviction establishes responsibility, but it cannot erase the consequences of the crime. It cannot return a husband to his family, restore a business owner to his employees, or undo the fear experienced by a community that witnessed such a public act of violence. Justice, in this sense, remains necessarily incomplete. Courts can determine guilt and impose punishment, but they cannot reverse history. The value of the judicial process lies instead in its affirmation that violence does not possess the final word. Through lawful procedures, evidence, and impartial judgment, society demonstrates that even the most powerful criminal organizations remain answerable before the law. For Libero Grassi, whose public refusal to surrender to extortion had cost him his life, that principle carried particular meaning. His assassination had been intended to reinforce the authority of organized crime. The convictions handed down in 2006 instead reinforced the authority of the legal system. The message delivered by the killers in 1991 had sought to spread fear. The message delivered by the court 15 years later affirmed accountability. Although delayed, justice had arrived. The legal chapter of the case had finally reached its conclusion. Yet the broader story of Libero Grassi was far from over. His death had already inspired public reflection, national debate, and renewed opposition to the system of Pizzo. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended, his name continued to symbolize courage, integrity, and resistance to organized crime. The legacy left behind by his life, and by the principles for which he ultimately died, would prove to be every bit as enduring as the verdicts themselves. When the legal proceedings concluded in 2006 with the convictions of Salvatore Madogna and Francesco Madogna for their roles in the murder of Libero Grassi, the judicial chapter of the case finally came to an end. Yet the historical significance of his story was never defined solely by the courtroom. Long before the verdicts were delivered, Grassi's death had already become one of the defining moments in Italy's struggle against organized crime. The assassination that was intended to reinforce fear instead forced an entire nation to confront uncomfortable questions about silence, responsibility, and the price of resisting criminal power. In many ways, The legacy of Libero Grassi did not begin after justice was served. It began on the very day he was killed. News of the assassination spread rapidly across Italy. A businessman had publicly refused to pay Pizzo, openly challenged the mafia through the press, endured months of intimidation, and was then murdered outside his own home in broad daylight. The sequence of events was impossible to ignore. His death immediately transcended the boundaries of a local criminal investigation and became a national event. Italians who had followed his story over the preceding months understood that this was not merely another mafia killing. It was an attack directed at the principle that honest citizens should be able to conduct lawful business without submitting to organized extortion. Public reaction reflected that understanding. According to the historical record, approximately 10,000 people gathered in Palermo to protest the mafia and to honor Libero Grassi's memory. Such a demonstration carried profound symbolic significance. Only months earlier, Grassi had found himself increasingly isolated as many business owners avoided public association with him out of fear of retaliation. After his death, however, thousands of ordinary citizens came together to express publicly what many had previously felt only in private. Their presence did not erase the fear that had long characterized life under the influence of Cosa Nostra, but it demonstrated that the assassination had failed to produce only silence. Instead, it generated grief, anger, and a growing willingness among many Italians to speak openly against organized crime. National media also devoted significant attention to the case. Television programs examined the murder, condemned Cosa Nostra, and encouraged society to reject the culture of omerta. This shift in public conversation represented an important consequence of Grassi's death. For years, silence had been one of organized crime's greatest allies. Every individual who chose not to speak, every witness who declined to cooperate, and every business owner who quietly accepted extortion contributed, whether intentionally or not, to the preservation of the system. The widespread public discussion following the assassination challenged that pattern. It encouraged Italians to consider whether silence protected communities or merely protected those who relied upon intimidation. Among the prominent voices reflecting on the significance of the murder was anti-mafia magistrate Giovanni Falcone. According to the available information, Falcone observed that the mafia could not ignore someone who had publicly challenged the entire extortion system. His statement captures one of the central realities of the case. Libero Grassi had not become a target simply because he refused to make a payment. The greater threat lay in the public nature of his refusal. Organized crime depends heavily upon reputation. It seeks to convince society that resistance is both dangerous and ultimately futile. When someone openly rejects that authority before the entire community, the challenge extends beyond a single financial dispute. It becomes a direct confrontation with the image of power upon which the organization depends. Falcone's observation, therefore, helps explain why Grassi's murder carried such symbolic weight. The assassination was intended to preserve fear by eliminating one of its most visible opponents. Yet history often reveals an irony that those responsible for violence fail to anticipate. Acts designed to suppress ideas sometimes succeed only in giving those ideas greater visibility. The death of Libero Grassi transformed his principles into a lasting public legacy. His family played an important role in preserving that legacy. According to the available record, they continued speaking publicly against the mafia after his death. Their determination ensured that Grassi's voice would not disappear with him. Continuing to denounce organized crime after experiencing such profound personal loss required considerable resolve. It also reflected the same refusal to surrender that had characterized Libero Grassi himself. Rather than allowing fear to dictate the future, His family remained committed to opposing the system that had taken his life. Perhaps the clearest expression of his enduring influence can be found in the emergence of the Addio Pizzo movement. According to the historical information provided, this movement drew powerful inspiration from Libero Grassi's sacrifice. Its message directly confronted the culture of extortion by encouraging businesses and consumers to reject the payment of pizzo. The movement represented an important shift in public engagement with the issue. Instead of treating resistance as the burden of isolated individuals, it sought to build collective action. The logic behind this approach addressed one of the greatest challenges Grassi had faced during his lifetime. His public stand had often left him standing largely alone. Addio Pizzo encouraged the idea that opposition to extortion should become a shared civic responsibility rather than the solitary choice of exceptionally courageous individuals. Although no movement can erase the dangers associated with confronting organized crime, collective action reduces the isolation that criminal organizations often exploit. In that sense, Addio Pizzo reflected one of the lessons many people drew from Grassi's experience. Resistance becomes stronger when communities refuse to leave individuals to face intimidation alone. Public memory also preserved his name in tangible ways. Roads, schools, and public squares throughout Italy were named in his honor. Such commemorations perform an important function within society. They transform historical events into everyday reminders. Children attending schools bearing his name encounter questions about who he was and why his story matters. Citizens walking through streets or gathering in public spaces named after Libero Grassi encounter a legacy woven into the ordinary landscape of daily life. These memorials ensure that his courage remains visible not only in history books, but also within the communities that continue to reflect upon Italy's struggle against organized crime. Annual commemorations further reinforce that memory. Each year, on August 29th, people gather at the site where Libero Grassi was murdered to remember both the man and the principles he represented. Such ceremonies are not simply acts of remembrance. They also reaffirm a collective commitment to rejecting the system that claimed his life. Returning each year to the place where violence occurred transforms a location once defined by fear into a place dedicated to memory, reflection, and civic responsibility. It is a reminder that history belongs not only to those who commit crimes, but also to those who refuse to forget their victims. Looking back across the entire story, one striking contrast emerges. Cosa Nostra sought to use the assassination as a demonstration of power. The intended message was unmistakable. Anyone who openly resisted Pizzo would face deadly consequences. In the immediate sense, the organization achieved its objective. Libero Grassi was murdered. His family suffered an immeasurable loss. A respected entrepreneur's life ended on a Palermo street. Yet history rarely measures success solely by immediate outcomes. Over time, the consequences of the assassination evolved in ways the killers could not fully control. Rather than disappearing into obscurity, Libero Grassi became one of the most enduring symbols of integrity in modern Italian history. Rather than reinforcing permanent silence, his death inspired renewed public opposition to extortion. Rather than allowing fear to erase his example, communities continued commemorating his courage decades after the crime itself. The significance of Libero Grassi's story, therefore, extends beyond the details of one criminal case. It illustrates the complex relationship between fear and courage, between violence and principle, between criminal authority and civic responsibility. His actions did not end the mafia. They did not eliminate extortion overnight. They did not immediately transform the culture in which he lived. History rarely changes so quickly. Instead, his contribution lay in demonstrating that resistance was possible. His refusal challenged an assumption that had become deeply rooted in everyday life, the belief that paying extortion was inevitable and that public opposition could never succeed, even though he paid for that challenge with his life. The example he left behind continued influencing others long after the gunshots had faded. It is important, however, not to romanticize his death. Libero Grassi did not become significant because he was murdered. He became significant because of the choices he made while he was alive. He believed that honest work should never be subordinated to criminal intimidation. He believed that businesses could not truly be free while financing those who ruled through fear. He believed that remaining silent strengthened the very system he opposed. Those convictions existed before the threats, before the intimidation, before the assassination. His death gave them historical visibility, but it was his life that gave them meaning. The legal convictions delivered years later affirmed responsibility for the crime. Public memorials preserved his name. Demonstrations, educational institutions, annual commemorations, and the Addio Pizzo movement carried his example into future generations. Together, these developments transformed one man's personal act of conscience into part of Italy's broader struggle against organized crime. Today, Libero Grassi is remembered not simply as a victim of Cosa Nostra, but as a symbol of moral courage, personal integrity, and peaceful resistance to criminal power. His story continues to remind us that organized crime survives not only through violence, but also through resignation, and that meaningful change often begins with individuals willing to reject what others have come to accept. On an August morning in 1991, bullets ended the life of a textile manufacturer who refused to pay Pizzo. Those bullets succeeded in silencing his voice, but they failed to silence the principles he defended. Decades later, his name still stands as a reminder that even in environments shaped by intimidation, the refusal to surrender one's conscience can leave a legacy far stronger than the fear intended to destroy it. When historians look back at the murder of Libero Grassi, they often begin with the gunshots that echoed through a Palermo street on the morning of August 29, 1991. Those few seconds have become inseparable from his name, fixed in public memory as the moment that transformed a businessman into one of Italy's most enduring anti-mafia symbols. Yet to understand the true significance of his story, it is necessary to look beyond the assassination itself. The bullets ended a life, but they did not create the ideas for which Libero Grassi is remembered. Those ideas had already been expressed months earlier, not through violence, but through a deliberate act of public conviction. Long before the murder investigation, the court proceedings, or the commemorations that followed, Grassi made a choice that fundamentally challenged the world around him. He decided that the profits generated by honest labor would not be used to strengthen organized crime. He believed that a business established through lawful work could not genuinely claim independence, while remaining subject to criminal extortion. That belief, simple in principle but extraordinary in practice, became the foundation of everything that followed. Looking back across the entire sequence of events, it becomes clear that this was never merely a conflict between one businessman and a criminal organization. It was a confrontation between two completely different visions of authority. On one side stood the belief that legitimate enterprise should operate according to law, personal responsibility, and voluntary economic exchange. On the other stood a system sustained by intimidation, obedience, and the expectation that fear would ultimately overcome resistance. The collision between those two ideas was inevitable once Libero Grassi made his position public. His open letter of January 10, 1991, represented far more than a refusal to pay Pizzo. It challenged the unwritten assumption that extortion should remain hidden behind closed doors. discussed only in whispers and endured without public acknowledgement. By addressing his extortionists openly through the press, Grassi removed secrecy from the equation. He exposed a relationship that organized crime preferred to keep invisible. Public visibility altered the balance of power because it invited society itself to witness what many already knew but seldom discussed openly. The importance of that letter, therefore, lies not only in its words but in its audience. It was read not only by those demanding payment, but also by fellow entrepreneurs, ordinary citizens, journalists, public officials, and everyone confronted with the question of whether silence should continue. That single act demonstrated that resistance could exist in public rather than remaining confined to private conversations. It also explains why investigators later regarded retaliation as the obvious motive for the murder. The mafia's authority depended upon preserving the certainty that public defiance would never become an acceptable example for others to follow. The intimidation campaign that followed the publication of the letter revealed another essential lesson. Violence does not begin with murder. Before the fatal attack came threatening telephone calls. Before the gunfire came the break-ins, the property damage, and the attempted arson attack against the factory. Before physical violence reached its final stage, psychological pressure sought to accomplish the same objective. Every threat carried the same underlying message: abandon your position, accept the rules already accepted by others, and return to silence. Equally revealing was the isolation that gradually surrounded Libero Grassi. According to the historical record, many fellow entrepreneurs avoided close association with him. Some customers ended their business relationships out of fear of becoming connected to someone openly challenging Cosa Nostra. These reactions were not presented as evidence of agreement with organized crime. Rather, they reflected the enormous influence of fear within communities living under the shadow of extortion. Fear rarely requires universal support for those who create it. It merely requires enough uncertainty that ordinary people begin adjusting their own behavior in anticipation of possible consequences. In that sense, the isolation experienced by Grassi illustrates one of the most effective mechanisms through which criminal organizations preserve control. They often do not need to threaten every individual directly if examples of retaliation persuade others to withdraw voluntarily. This reality makes Libero Grassi's criticism of silence particularly significant. His concern extended beyond his own personal circumstances. He recognized that the continuation of Piso depended not only upon those demanding money, but also upon a widespread belief that resistance was impossible. As long as entrepreneurs accepted extortion as an unavoidable cost of doing business, the system would continue reproducing itself. Breaking that cycle required more than individual courage. It required changing the expectations shared by an entire community. The events following the assassination suggest that, despite the tragic outcome, such a transformation gradually began. The immediate reaction throughout Italy demonstrated that many people interpreted the murder not as an isolated crime, but as a challenge directed toward society itself. Thousands gathered in Palermo to denounce the mafia and honor Grassi's memory. Television programs publicly condemned organized crime and encouraged rejection of Omerta. His family continued speaking against the system responsible for his death. Years later, the Addio Pizzo movement would draw inspiration from his example while encouraging businesses and consumers alike to reject extortion collectively rather than individually. Together, these developments suggest that although Cosa Nostra succeeded in taking Libero Grassi's life, it failed to prevent his message from reaching a far wider audience than it had before the assassination. The judicial process further reinforced that transformation. Years of investigation eventually led to convictions identifying both the gunman and the individual. found responsible for ordering the killing. Justice arrived slowly, requiring persistence, cooperation from Pentiti, and the careful work of investigators and prosecutors. The long delay between the crime and the verdicts reminds us that accountability in organized crime cases often demands patience measured not in months, but in years. Yet the eventual convictions carried importance beyond punishment alone. They demonstrated that violence committed to defend criminal authority could still be examined, challenged, and judged through lawful institutions. This principle remains central to understanding the broader historical significance of the case. Organized crime depends not only upon economic power or armed force, but also upon the belief that its authority is permanent and beyond meaningful challenge. Every successful investigation and conviction weakens that perception by demonstrating that criminal organizations remain accountable under the law. The legacy of Libero Grassi, therefore, belongs simultaneously to several different histories. It belongs to the history of organized crime in Sicily, where Pizzo and Omerta shaped the lives of countless businesses for many years. It belongs to the history of Italy's legal struggle against Cosa Nostra, where investigators, prosecutors, judges, and cooperating witnesses gradually dismantled barriers that once appeared insurmountable. It also belongs to the history of civic courage, illustrating how a single individual can influence public understanding simply by refusing to accept what others have come to regard as inevitable. Importantly, remembering Libero Grassi should never involve celebrating the violence that ended his life. The significance of his story lies elsewhere. It lies in the fact that he believed honest work should never finance criminal intimidation. It lies in his conviction that lawful enterprise and extortion could not coexist without compromising freedom itself. It lies in his willingness to express those beliefs publicly despite the increasingly obvious dangers surrounding him. His death made him a symbol, but his principles gave that symbol meaning. Without those principles, the murder would represent only another tragic act of organized violence. With them, it became a turning point remembered throughout Italy's continuing struggle against the mafia. Today, annual commemorations, public spaces bearing his name, and movements inspired by his example continue preserving that memory. They remind new generations that history is often shaped not only by those who possess power, but also by those willing to question how that power is exercised. The story of Libero Grassi demonstrates that resistance does not always achieve immediate victory. Sometimes it demands extraordinary sacrifice. Yet it also demonstrates that the consequences of moral courage cannot be measured solely by the events of a single day. The shots fired on by Vittorio Alfieri succeeded in ending one life, but they failed to extinguish the ideas that life represented. Decades later, Libero Grassi remains remembered not because he sought confrontation, but because he refused to surrender his integrity. His name endures as a reminder that the greatest challenge to organized crime often begins with an individual who decides that fear should no longer determine the limits of justice, responsibility, and freedom. In the end, the murder of Libero Grassi stands as both a tragedy and a testament. A tragedy because an honest businessman lost his life for refusing to support criminal extortion, and a testament because his refusal helped reshape public awareness, inspired future resistance to Pizzo, and secured his place as one of the defining symbols of courage in Italy's long and difficult fight against organized crime.